Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici is a book about the emergence of capitalism in Europe, analyzing its effects on the treatment of women in society. The book draws attention to ways in which capitalism became intertwined with patriarchy, examining how women came to be exploited, marginalized, and oppressed over the last 5 centuries up until the present day. A specific focus on the second chapter of the book, the accumulation of labor and the degradation of women, outlines how women's labor became devalued against the emerging capitalist systems. Capitalism was not an inevitable evolution from feudalism. It was a violent process of enclosure and accumulation imposed by the European elites who remained after peasant rebellions and anti-feudal movements had liberated the population from serfdom.
So Federici goes into the history of the so-called transition from feudalism to capitalism to demonstrate how this was not a peaceful transition. The book is quite thorough and provides a compelling historical analysis. To give you a snapshot, here are the Coles notes. So the devastation of the Black Plague greatly reduced the labor force, meaning there was more work than workers, and this had the effect of hugely increasing the real wages of peasants and decreasing their rents. After feudalism began to decline, peasants lived for a time in a somewhat more egalitarian society, sharing the commons for subsistence. However, this led to a crisis of accumulation among the remaining elites and nobles, since no one wanted to work for them anymore. So, to rectify this problem, European elites began the process of enclosure. That is, they began to fence off the lands held in common and claim them as private property. This in turn created a scarcity of land for the peasants to live off of, which forced millions of people into the cities to trade their subsistence lifestyle in for waged labor. This was not an upgrade in the quality of life, and women were most negatively impacted by this process, as the commons were central to their way of life. So when money was introduced, women began to find it more and more difficult to make a living, with their options becoming increasingly limited, confining them mostly to child rearing and housekeeping. And this was enforced through degradation and violence. Those who spoke out about this treatment were considered disobedient wives, scolds, witches, and whores. Consensus across the board, from the church to the intellectuals, led to the obsessive vilification of women and their violent punishments for nonconformity through witch trials and ostracization.
Federici also discusses prostitution becoming a way for men to receive domestic labor from women when unmarried. However, once criminalized, women were punished while men were not. This only increased male dominance and power, where men could name a woman as a prostitute and she would immediately face punitive measures. Additionally, population growth was believed to be tied to a nation's wealth, which led to an increased value in marriage and sexuality. Therefore, labor force expansion furthered the exploitation of women's reproductive systems, as they were controlled in order to keep up with the growing labor demands.
These growing labor demands and the government's desire to have a wealthy, populous nation are what made a woman's value tied to their ability to reproduce, incentivizing laws of marriage in order to increase the value of family and subsequently reproduction. Giving the government the ability to control family affairs and women's bodies by limiting access to birth control, penalizing any form of sexual activity not intended for procreation. The government also penalized any woman who sought aid through natural methods, such as herbalism, accusing them of witchcraft, ultimately keeping women's bodies in control of the government. In conclusion, Silvia Federici explores how capitalism's emergence in Europe is intertwined with the subjugation and degradation of women, detailing the violent transition from feudalism to capitalism, emphasizing the enclosure of common lands and the devaluation of women's labor, leading to the government controlling various aspects of women's lives and autonomy, including their bodies, opportunity, and reproductive rights, consequently creating the witch hunt, a system put in place by the government to punish women when they stepped out of their sexist roles and forced position in society.